On February 9th, 2024, Phantom Nightmare was officially legal for tournament play. And oh boy, was it a nightmare for some competitive players. It released new Snake Eyes cards, which took the deck from irrelevant to the biggest threat in the format. In case you weren't kept up with the game during this time, the most dominant decks of this format were Snake Eyes variants, notably the Fire King and Pure versions. If you played one of these decks during this time, you might think that even in a metagame dominated by these two decks, the format wasn't that bad, since the mirror matches between these decks generally had some back and forth, as well as opportunities to outplay your opponent. However, not all players felt this way, and I would say the biggest reason that players complained about this format more so than prior quote-unquote tier 0 formats is partially because of the price of these decks. The cost of playing one of these decks is close to $1,000 US, which is the most expensive a tier 1 deck has been in Yu-Gi-Oh for a long time, meaning unless you were an ultra competitive player or just had boatloads of money lying around, you wouldn't be able to play the best deck of the format. This is pretty frustrating as a competitive player or as a new player that's trying to start playing competitively, since the cost is a huge barrier to entry. However, at the end of the day, Konami is a business and their goal is to make money, meaning that something like this is probably bound to happen again in the future. But what if I told you that there was a systematic formula that you could follow so that you would never have to shell out an exorbitant amount of money to play at the highest level, whether it be for the current Snake Eyes format or another metagame in the future? My name is Tcg Sam, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you a complete guide on how to play at the highest competitive level without having to break the bank. Now, before we start, I just want to clarify that how much each player has to spend on the game is going to vary wildly depending on their personal circumstances. So instead of talking about specific cards or decks that are quote-unquote budget friendly, I'm going to be showing you how you can go about finding the right decks and replacements for expensive cards for any format that you play in the future, regardless of your budget. I'm going to be using the Phantom Nightmare format from the beginning of 2024 in all my examples, since it was the most recent metagame at the time of recording, but the concepts I cover will apply for any format, so you'll be able to take away something regardless of when you watch this video. So with all that being said, let's get straight into it. The first thing that you should do every format is learn what the best decks do and what their strengths and weaknesses are. This is especially important if you're not playing the best deck of the format and have to play something that is less powerful due to your budget constraints, since you won't be able to rely on the sheer power of your deck to carry you through most of the time. The reason you should understand what the strengths and weaknesses of the meta decks are so you can find what the best overall strategy for countering these decks are, and then from there find decks and tech cards that are able to meet that win condition. Let's take the Fire King Snake Eye deck as an example and go over a very simplified and condensed list of some of its strengths and weaknesses. Some of its strengths include a great grind game given to it by Flamber's Dragon and the Fire King cards. It's also not as susceptible to board breakers because a lot of their cards will float. And finally, they have a lot of strong standalone cards like Snake Eye Ash that can do a lot on their own. Some of the weaknesses that it has are its a weakness to certain hand traps like Dimension Shifter, an over-reliance on one or two cards to get their play started like Snake Eye Ash or Diabellstar, as well as being weak to specific floodgates like ones that restrict special summoning from the deck, ones that banish everything, or prevent adding from deck to the hand. Now, while this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, making quick and simple lists like this one should give you a good idea of generally how you'll deal with the top decks out there, allowing you to formulate a suitable game plan. Taking a look at the list we just created for the Snake Eyes Fire King deck, we can deduce that hand traps will be very popular against this deck since it's one of the few weaknesses that it might have. As a result, you'll want to look for a strategy that has the ability to play a lot of hand traps in their deck, but also not be too susceptible to them since other decks will be playing a lot of hand traps to beat the Snake Eyes Fire King deck. Once you have a very broad idea of what you want your deck to do, then you can start looking into decks that actually fit that criteria. It's important to note that any deck you find should also not have the same weaknesses as the top deck out there, since people are going to be building their decks to beat it and you don't want to be caught in the crossfire. You'll see that during the Fire King Snake Eyes format, the most popular budget decks in this format were ones that could take advantage of the few weaknesses that the Snake Eyes deck had. For example, a deck that could play a lot of hand traps, but were also not too susceptible to them due to their one card combo plays was Marincess. Another popular budget deck during this format were the different stun variants, ranging from Fossil Dyna Stun to Runic Stun. These stun decks capitalized on the Snake Eyes deck's weakness to Floodgates, and in particular, the Fossil Dyna variant took advantage of the fact that the Snake Eyes monsters are very small and they generally don't have a great way to out a monster without ever special summoning or drawing a non-engine card like Infinite Impermanence. Yet another viable and pretty budget-friendly deck in this format was Fluandereeze, which is generally pretty ignorant of what your opponent is playing, since their boss monster is a Floodgate that affects most decks out there, and they can play some of the nastiest Floodgates themselves like Dimension Shifter and Harpy's Featherstorm. Now I know some of you budget players out there might still consider the decks I've mentioned to not really be within your budget constraint, and I just want to say that in the right format, even something as simple as 3 structure decks can be enough to beat the best deck out there. Back in 2023, when CardTrader was the best deck, 3 Traptrick structure decks were essentially viable enough to consistently compete against it, since they could exploit CardTrader's weakness of having their monsters flip face down when they're summoned. It truly doesn't get more budget friendly than 3 structure decks, so don't lose hope if there's a format where you feel like you can't compete due to your budget restraints. Even though these decks were all trying to accomplish the same broad goal of capitalizing on the weakness of the best deck of the format, you'll notice that all of them have their own unique set of strengths and weaknesses as well. There usually isn't going to be only 1 or 2 viable counter decks that can beat the top meta decks in every format, meaning that you'll still be able to find a strategy that works for your budget constraints as well as still accomplishes the goal of beating the best deck. The next section of this video will talk about how you can find those specific tech cards once you've found the core engine for your deck. But before we get to that, I just want to ask you to please subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying what you see. Only a very small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed to the channel, so if this video gave you anything useful at all, I'd really appreciate it if you could show your support by subscribing. These videos take a lot longer for me to create than my other ones, so you can let me know if you want to see more by subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment to help the YouTube algorithm. Anyways, let's move on to the next section. Do you ever wonder why certain tech cards that you might have never heard of before suddenly become the new staples in a certain format? That's because Yugioh actually has a lot of niche cards that can suddenly be good one format but be almost useless in other ones. Some of these cards are so good against the best decks out there that even if your deck isn't as powerful as them, just by playing these powerful cards, you'll have given yourself a much better chance to stay competitive against them. Now the way I like to find these perfect tech cards for the current format is to look at what cards have historically been good in past formats where the top decks have had similar weaknesses to the ones they have now. For example, Different Dimension Ground was a floodgate that was played in many different formats in the past, since there are always decks that rely on having their monsters hit the graveyard in order to be good. While the Snake Eyes decks don't exactly do the same thing as all the decks DDG was good against, it's a catch-all type of card that should work good enough if there aren't more specific counter options that could be found. A more niche but perhaps more potent tech card specifically against Snake Eyes could be Deck Lockdown, since it shuts down 2 key components of the deck, adding cards from deck to hand and special summoning from the deck. This card was notably used back in 2015 when Necros dominated the format with their tech cards, and back in 2017 when Zodiac always special summoned from the deck using Rapier and Barrage. Just by looking at past meta decks that have at least had some of the same weaknesses as the current ones should give you some idea of what tech cards could potentially work against the current threat that you're dealing with. Another slower but more thorough way you could find cards is using the Dueling Book description search feature, where you put in a keyword and try to find all the cards that have that word in it. So for example, you could put in the word Banish, since banishing cards is good against the Snake Eyes Fire King deck. Dueling Book will give you a list of all the cards that have Banish in its word text, meaning you could potentially discover a new tech card that no one else has ever used before, but do keep in mind that this does take a lot longer than the other method. However, this could be a good way to find new tech cards if there haven't been any tech options that were used against similar decks in the past. Now that you're familiar with the best deck's strengths and weaknesses and some cards that could potentially be used to counter them, in this final section, I'll be going over how you can find budget replacements for cards that may be out of your budget range, or replacements for tech cards that you may have discovered but can't get access to. While it's all well and good to find decks or tech cards that are good against the current meta decks, they're inevitably going to involve some sort of combination of expensive cards that may be out of your budget. That's not even mentioning the potentially expensive staples that most of these decks would have to play in order to even be competitive in the first place. However, even as a budget player, not all hope is lost. In this section, I'll be giving you tips on how you can find budget replacements for expensive staples, and tips on how to play even the most expensive meta decks at a more budget level. Let's start with how to find alternatives to expensive tech cards. Due to the expansiveness of the card pool, there are inevitably going to be cards that fulfill similar, if not the same role as some of the expensive staple cards out there. Let me give you a few examples to show you how you can start looking for those replacement cards. At the time of recording, Triple Tactics Thrust is a pretty commonly played staple cards in a lot of the top decks out there, even if it isn't found in every single deck list. The main strength that this card has is its flexibility, allowing you to instantly get access to a variety of powerful normal spells and traps that are good in different situations. It's pretty interesting that for the most part, the cards that Triple Tactics Thrust gets, like Triple Tactics Talents and Evenly Matched, are fairly cheap. The point I want to make is that while it's definitely incredibly strong to have a multitude of different options from just a single card, it should be feasible to simply swap out that card for more copies of whatever cards you're trying to get. For example, say that your deck is fairly consistent but struggles with breaking boards. Instead of playing Thrust, you can consider playing more copies of the board breakers that Thrust would get, like Triple Tactics Talents and Evenly Matched instead, since that's what you're likely grabbing with them anyways. On the flip side, if your deck is somewhat inconsistent but can break boards okay, then you may just want to play more consistency cards over Triple Tactics Thrust instead. Regardless of your situation, I believe that with enough testing, you'll be able to find out what it is your deck truly needs, and you'll be able to find suitable replacements to fulfill the exact roles that your deck needs more often. Now, I know you're probably thinking that the example I used was pretty specific to Thrust and wouldn't really be applicable to other expensive staples. That's true, so I'm going to be giving you another example of how you can find suitable replacements for expensive tech cards. Back in 2017, when Zodiac was the most dominant deck, Dimensional Barrier was an insane card that would shut off the entire Zodiac turn. At that time, it was also a very expensive card since it only had its original secret rare printing from Invasion of Vengeance. However, it wasn't the only card that was being played at the time that could be used to beat Zodiac. Taking a look at a top performing deck list during this time, you'll notice a variety of different tech cards that were also incredibly powerful against the Zodiac deck and were incredibly budget friendly. Take a card like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, which had the potential to remove Zodiac monsters that activated on summon, like Rat Pier and Throwablade, essentially making it so your opponent couldn't access the extra deck anyways unless they had an extender. Or take a look at a card like Book of Moon. Even if your opponent could access the extra deck, by using Book of Moon on their monster, it would essentially make it so they couldn't continue their plays anyways. These cards, while not doing the exact same thing as Dimensional Barrier, still fulfilled similar roles since they were just making it so your opponent wouldn't be able to continue XYZ summoning. The point is, even if you have to play cards that are worse at fulfilling one role, there will be other strengths that these substitute cards have that can make up for it. Finally, I want to talk about how there are going to be times where you can actually play some meta decks in the format with just a few changes to its core engine. Using this Snake Eyes deck as an example, you could have replaced the expensive Bonfires and Wanted engine with the super heavy Samurai engine, and still have a very powerful deck that takes advantage of how powerful the core Snake Eyes engine is. After all, it wasn't cards like Snake Eyes Ash and Snake Eyes Poplar that were absurdly expensive, rather it was the Wanted engine as well as Bonfires. The Super Heavy Samurai engine complemented the Snake Eyes engine in the same way as the Wanted package and Bonfire did, since they allow you to make Infernal Flame Banshee to act as a consistency card, while also giving you the added benefit of being a flexible rank 4 outlet for cards like Baguska or a potential Synchro engine as well. There are plenty of engines out there like the Super Heavy Samurais that have flown under the radar just because they aren't the most optimal. However, by experimenting with other cards or engines that can fill the same role as some of the more expensive cards in a meta deck, you could potentially find a suitable replacement to still allow you to take advantage of the best engine or best deck of a format without having to break the bank. In the case with Super Heavy Samurai Snake Eyes, although you could argue the Super Heavy Samurai cards were worse in quality than the Wanted engine and Bonfires, since they wouldn't give you the same level of consistency and introduce a couple of unwanted bricks into the deck, it's a pretty small price to pay if you wanted to play at the highest level, especially since the Super Heavy Samurai cards, like I've mentioned before, also bring a unique set of strengths that the Bonfire and Wanted engine didn't necessarily have. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope this guide was able to help you have a better understanding of how you can find a suitable deck to beat the meta contenders out there, regardless of your budget in any format, as well as find appropriate tech cards to beat the meta. Although I use the Snake Eyes Fire King metagame at the start of 2024 as my examples, these principles will apply for any format, both past and future. If you think I missed anything important, then please let me know in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to get back to them. With all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.